Welcome to the I Made a podcast, where we hear from podcasters about what they've learned since starting their own show, so you can do the same. And now, here's your host, Chris Creary.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. I'm so glad that you're here. Today, I'm speaking with a podcasting veteran. If you search the word podcast in the dictionary, you'll find his picture beside it. Today, I'm speaking with Bruce Chamoff, who is the Godfather of Podcast Networks. That's what he says. But he's the one who started this all back in 2005, I think. But we're going to get into all of those details in a second, and I'm going to get him to explain it to you. This was an amazing episode. So he's been in podcasting for such a long time. He runs the World Podcast Network. So much insight, so much wisdom. He has an amazing podcast that I want all of you to listen to. So I placed links for all of his podcasts down below on the World Podcast Network. This conversation that I had with Bruce was amazing. I've learned so much in this short time that I had with him. Like, we packed it in this conversation. So let me go get Bruce, and we're going to have this conversation about podcasting now. And make sure you have your note and your pen and paper so that you can take notes and write things down. And if you're driving right now, or if you're working out, you can't write things down, listen to this again and make notes and remember things that we've talked about today, because this was an episode full with insights and wisdom, things that you can apply to your podcast. If you haven't started yet, or if you're just new to podcasting, lots of stuff you can learn from this episode. So let me go get Bruce right now, and I'll be back at the end of the episode to wrap things up. Hello, everyone. Welcome to I Made a Podcast. You know my name. My name is Chris Creary, but today I'm speaking with a podcasting all-star, a veteran. He's been in the space for years. I think you've probably been in podcasting even longer than that word has been in the dictionary. But I'm speaking with Bruce Chamoff. Bruce, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Chris. Thanks for having me on. Wonderful. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. This is excellent. I'm excited to talk to you because I'm excited to pick your brain and get all of the podcasting goodness out of you so that we can all learn and become better podcasters. So for the people who have not heard about you before, can you share a little bit, maybe introduce yourself, your podcast, and what you've been working on?
Oh, absolutely. I've been podcasting since 2005, and a lot of people, some people still don't understand that the word podcasting came from the Apple iPod, but they probably don't realize that because the iPod really isn't as popular now as it was back in 2005 because everything's streaming online. But that's when it started. I got into it when I briefly heard about it, and I was in a bookstore and I saw Todd Cochran's book. A lot of people know him from the Blueberry Network. This book had the most outrageous cover. It was silver. And when I say silver, like, it was a reflection. You can actually see your face in the cover of the book. And it had dark green lettering. Most books don't even have that combination. It was Introduction to Podcasting. And just, I thought to myself, wow, I heard of podcasting and here's the book. Picked it up, read about 3 pages, and I was already sold, and I bought it. And I read the book within an hour. And I was like excited at that point. So I started. And I started podcasting because I'm a musician. I'm a songwriter. And I wanted to get out original music from not just myself, but also local musicians in my area, which was Long Island, New York at that time. And I started the Fresh Music series. And as I podcasted more, I got better at it, started learning the nuances. We weren't editing podcasts so much back then, so they were sloppier back then, not like they are now where they get all edited. And
yes,
and it was a fun thing to do. And then I realized, being the entrepreneur that I am, I always like taking on new projects. And we talked about our dads before. I mean, I got this from my father. He was an entrepreneur. I wanted to build something more than just one podcast, and I'm a web developer. So I figured, take my web development experience, take my marketing experience, let's create a website that actually will have more than one podcast in multiple genres. And that's what I did. I called it the Long Island Podcast Network. And before I knew it, within about 2 months, I had about 20 different podcasters on it. So it grew pretty quickly within that time. And now we have 1,100 podcasts on the World Podcast Network. That whole thing grew from then. But it was incredible because podcasting was the start of something huge. I knew it was not a trend. I saw it as a total marketing strategy for companies. Just like back in 1995, wow, only like 10 years before that, when the first website became really popular, I was actually asked by people, are websites a trend? I'm like, no, they're not a trend because companies are marketing themselves. And I
Right.
saw the same exact potential for marketing in podcasts. So I was convinced it was not going anywhere. And then I just kept building up that podcast network from time to time. In 2017, 12 years later, we made it to New York City Podcast Network. And in 2023, I made it to World Podcast Network. Now we're just exploding.
Wow, that's awesome. So I see the evolution there. So you identified that podcasting would grow into something huge
Oh,
back
yeah.
in 2005 when you started. And I see the evolution of your name. So now, how you call it World Podcast Network, and you have 1,100 podcasts on your network now. What countries do they range from? Like, what's the furthest country away? So I'm on that network and I'm in Canada. I know you probably have a lot of people from the States on the World Podcast Network. Where else are people on the World Podcast Network from?
So we have podcasts from Australia, South Africa, Germany, Italy, Israel, the UK. We have one from Japan.
Mm.
We had somebody just join from Ireland. So we're getting there. I mean, we have about 15 countries, and technically we have literally about 5 different languages. So I'm hoping that that's going to explode into almost every single dialect out there. But yeah, I mean, we have podcasts from all over. Actually, we have one from Argentina now, and I'm
Oh,
losing
nice.
track. Yeah, I'm losing track of it all. But we started in the United States, so that of course is our biggest country, Canada and Australia and the UK. So those 4 English-speaking countries are the biggest ones right now.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So so you have the World Podcast Network, but you are also a podcast. So you do
Yep.
have your own show, right? Which is Become a Successful Podcaster. You want to tell us a
Yes.
little bit about that podcast?
Sure. Obviously, the market is mostly podcasters and actually people who want to guest on podcasts. But I was getting the same questions over and over again from podcasters because now they see me as an authority, which is such a great
Mhm.
feeling. I never really pushed myself as an expert or an authority, but because I run this busy network, people now come to me and they ask me questions about editing, about monetization, about growth, all types of things. And I decided maybe I should create a podcast to answer those questions to more on the mass level and the global level. Because if I'm going to get those same questions over and over again, I'm never going to be able to answer everybody. I might as well just make episode after episode after episode. And that's what I did. So I started that podcast in 2020, I think 2021, like right in the middle of the pandemic. And we are now getting a lot of people on this podcast as well.
Yeah,
So, and I'm
wonderful.
glad you listened to it too. So,
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, my whole thing is I want to continue to learn, and that's kind of like why I started this podcast because I get to talk to other podcasters and learn what they're doing and then apply it to myself. So I have
yeah,
2 podcasts on my own. I have the Faith Fight podcast, which I've been doing for since 2019, so just about five and a half years now, and then this podcast, which I started in January 2024. But I've learned so much through interviewing other podcasters in
absolutely.
the last, few months that I've started this podcast, and it has helped me so much. There's been so much tools that I have found that have like literally saved me from re-recording stuff that have when I had mistakes on podcasts. I would literally could use some online tools, clean up audio where I didn't need to re-record it again.
Yeah.
Such a huge time saver. And it's all because I connected with other podcasters and started to learn what they're using, tools, tips, tricks. So I've learned so much through this podcast, through listening to podcasts like yours. Now I want to pick your brain a little bit, right? Because through my conversations with all these podcasters, there's a few things that are challenging for podcasts. So this is a 2-part question for you. Number one, maybe I'll ask you one at a time. What was your biggest challenge that you have heard from other podcasters or that you have seen yourself that you either have overcome or you're in the process of overcoming right now?
Well, there are two that really come to mind. I mean, without a doubt, it's just getting started. And that wasn't really a challenge for me particularly, but I do find that with a lot of other people. Getting started is probably the biggest challenge that people have. They don't know what equipment to have. They don't know what software. I mean, you were just talking about equipment and software. People don't know. And yes, they can Google it. They can go to YouTube and how to start a podcast, but people still come to me with these questions. And I've done webinars on business networking events as well. Once you get started and you do that first episode, it all becomes easier, but it's getting over that hump. And I could just tell people that all you have to do is like anything else. Don't think about it, because the more you think, the slower you're going to go, the more you're going to stop yourself, and you're going to think too much. Overthinking is probably like your worst enemy.
Yes.
And I just tell people right away, go out, buy a microphone. If you can't afford a microphone, use your phone, but be aware that the phone is not going to sound great, because you're going to hear that whole radio type of quality when you hear like other people talking on the radio. You need a really good microphone. You have one, I have one, fits right into your USB. Or if you have a little more money, you can get an XLR microphone, and they're a little more expensive. And then you can get one of those podcasting mixing stations. They cost a
Yes.
couple of $100s, and they really are good. I mean, they're very clear, but a lot of
Yes.
people can't afford it, so you just use your computer and get a USB. I was originally using the Samson, which is made by Sam Ash. I'm talking about as a musician because I go to that store all the time.
Mhm.
And Sam Ash, that's actually now going out of business, and they're having all these liquidation sales, but they were around for literally like 35 years before podcasting. Go there, go to Staples, go to Best Buy, and buy a USB microphone. They're literally about $50 to $60. They're a really good investment, and you don't have to pay over $100.
Yeah.
And then always think about, how am I going to edit the podcast? I'm sure you've used Audacity. It's free, because he said free
Absolutely.
software. And Audacity is a great tool. It works amazingly well with podcasts. They've been around for about 10 years. And I don't understand why they don't charge. They can make a lot of money like this, but I'm not going to question it either. They're free. They're out there. You download it. It's right on your computer. It works on both Mac and Windows. And you can't get anything better than that. I mean, out of any free software, Audacity is the best quality. And I wouldn't mind paying for it, but who cares? They're not charging. So I tell people that. That leads me to the second challenge, as you were asking.
Yeah.
Editing podcasts. That is probably the biggest time consumer out of any podcast. That's the biggest task. And I don't want to scare people away. Editing is not fun, but if you do spend the time editing, you will end up with a very high quality sounding podcast. I honestly think that editing is not as hard as it sounds. All you have to do is edit out the breaths. Like every time you talk, is okay. I hate that. I can't stand that. And then there's all the filler words. And
Like, yeah.
if you're a teenager, you say like. My daughter's 20 now. She's not saying that anymore, but she was saying it. She came on my podcast, and I'm going to go to like the store. I feel like, but you don't. I mean, and what's funny is you don't even hear yourself say that. I don't even hear myself say these things half the time. But if you edit it, you hear it, and you think to yourself, "Oh my gosh, did I really say that?" It's just you ignore it naturally, but you have to listen back to the recording. You take your mouse, you select those filler words, and you hit the delete button, and you're done.
Yes.
So those two challenges are the biggest ones. If you can deal with them, obviously getting started is a one-time thing.
Mm-hmm.
You get started once and you're good to go, and now you're off and running. The second one is ongoing.
Right.
Now I also hire people on Fiverr.com to edit my podcast, because I can't stand doing it, So I literally I have an editor, and that's another thing people do. I mean, you want a podcast, you want to talk, you don't want to edit it, fine, hire someone to do it.
I love where you're going. I love where you're taking this conversation.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
there's so much. Okay, so let me try my best to. I want to just add a little bit to
Sure.
that. So first of all, you talked about starting, right? One of the
Yep.
things I've realized that that's one of the challenges that podcasters have as well. So one of the things that I have done is I've created a cheat sheet for podcasters that has a list of software and hardware, everything that you could need to start a podcast is on this resource guide. So for everyone
I
listening
like
out
that.
there, if you want to get this cheat sheet, it's in the description of this episode. Now, I call it a cheat sheet because I found out that there's a lot of apps online that give you like a free, period of it or a free portion of you. So you can actually use it without actually sinking any money into it and get good quality results,
That's
right?
great.
And technology has gotten so good right now, like through all of these AI tools and stuff like that. So moving towards editing now, and you're right, editing is really time consuming. A lot of people, they start a podcast, but then they give it up because they don't have time to edit it and,
That's
cut
right.
things out and do this and do that. But there's a lot of tools out there. And I have, like I said, get the resource guide that I have in the description. There is a tool. I mean, you've probably heard of Descript. That's one tool that people use to actually you upload your audio and it can find the filler words and you click a button and it deletes it. So it cuts down your editing time. It's amazing. I love Descript. And there's a whole bunch of other tools that are out there, all these AI tools that can actually make the process of editing easier. But like you said, if you still can't stand the editing process, you can hire an editor. And I'm so glad you said that because I don't think I told you this before, but I myself am a podcast editor. It's what I love to do, actually. So I have my own podcasts that I edit and I produce those ones, but I also have clients that come to me and they just give me their audio and I take care of all the editing for them. So if you can handle the editing of your podcast, regardless of how many tools that you've tried online that make it really easy for you, but if you still can't stand it, hire a podcast editor, just like how Bruce mentioned. And that's what I do. So if you even want to reach out to me, I can absolutely help anyone out there listening. I can help you with your podcast. So Bruce, thank you so much. Wonderful insights. And I'm sure it's helpful. Now, this is the type of insight that people can get when they listen to your podcast, how to become a successful podcaster. So thank you for sharing that, Bruce. I want to ask another question. Now, a lot of podcasters talk about promoting their podcast, how to promote the podcast, how to get the most traction, how to get engagement, how to get downloads. Can you share any strategies for any podcasters out there on how they can promote their podcasters to actually get people to listen and download and follow and subscribe and all those good things that we want to get through our podcast? What can we do?
Well, marketing, I mean, in general, marketing podcasts in and of itself is kind of challenging because we always come up as spammers. And I run another LinkedIn group that has 2,000 members, and my better half, Shari Post, she has joined me as an admin as well in the LinkedIn group. And the LinkedIn group it's called the Podcast Support Community. It's owned by the network, by the World
Nice.
Podcast Network. And we don't let people post their episodes unless we have one post ourselves and we say, hey, add a comment with your latest episode, because we don't want people to spam everything, right? So the first thing I'm going to tell people is don't think you can go on social media of any kind and tell people to listen to your podcast unless it's a specific social media segment of your own, like a Facebook page that's specifically for your own organization or your podcast. And of course, your subscribers would subscribe to that. So that's marketing strategy number one. Start a Facebook page, not a group, a Facebook page, or any social media that you want, even Instagram, and tell people subscribe, follow, and we'll show you when the next episode comes out. But sometimes social media you can hit a wall with as well, because it's so competitive and it's so inundated.
Yes.
And that alone makes social media weaker at times, right? So I also tell people, network, like you and I are doing, Chris, network with other podcasters. And that's something that a lot of podcasters do not think. They just make their show, and sometimes they compete with other podcasters in the same space. I don't like competing. I think competition sucks.
Yes, I
So
agree.
I I think you can eliminate the competition by joining the competition and networking with them. And I've done that with so many podcasts. And the podcasters themselves will push you to their audience as well as you reciprocate. So
Exactly.
that's a great form of marketing. It doesn't cost anything, just takes a little time. And really, to me, those are the two number one tips I can give on social media marketing for your own podcast.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. I believe the way that I've heard it is instead of competing with other people that you are close to or have the same audience, you
Yep.
can collaborate with them.
Yes.
I'm sure you may have heard this, a rising tide raises all ships. So if you work together to help someone else who is, connected to you, everybody will be encouraged and rise up together. So I've connected with yourself, who has the World Podcast Network, and you're also a podcaster. There was another person that I spoke to last month. Her name is Danny Marie, and she's a podcast planning strategist. And of course, through this podcast, I speak to podcasters every single time. But it's good to hear from people who actually work on podcasts for other people and connect
Yeah,
with
that's
people
great.
from that perspective, because we can work together. Our audiences are the same. So if there's someone who's, I can help them with this, but at one point or another, my expertise will come to a limit. I could say, hey, Bruce, this person, I've helped them with this and this and this. I want to pass them off to you so that their podcast can come on the World Podcast Network, right? Because if I
Right.
think about it, actually now it's a logical transition, right? Because I'm helping a lot of people launch their podcasts, right? Once they get their podcast launched, hey, they want to take it to the next level. I could say, hey, Bruce, here's so and so. They just launched their podcast. They want to join the World Podcast Network and get more exposure, help find guests, and do everything that the World Podcast Network can do to help them get to that next level. Again, instead of me and you competing, we're collaborating and we're
Exactly.
helping
Yeah.
people reach their goals, right? So I would hope that this encourages everybody to help get to that place where they can not see other people as competition, but see them as people who they can potentially collaborate with and work with and do some great things to help other people reach their goals and their objectives with their podcast. So
Absolutely.
wonderful insight that you shared there, Bruce. Now, one of the other things that people talk about is monetization. Now, I listened to a few episodes of your podcast, and you touched on it a little bit. And I picked out a few things that you were doing on your podcast, which are pretty good. But what tips do you have for podcasters about monetization? Everybody wants to make something with their podcast, at least to break even. But
Yes.
what tips do you have in terms of monetization that we can learn?
Well, definitely know your audience before you even start monetizing. That is really important. And when I tell people this, sometimes I get a little too technical because I'm a marketing person, but you have to understand the demographics of your audience as well. Because if you're going to monetize, you might be either pushing an affiliate program, and that's a good thing too, or you might be selling something. But a lot of people, they try doing monetization without understanding the audience. To me, that's the biggest mistake. And when I say demographics, we hear what demographics are. We're talking about the age, the religion. I mean, a whole combination. What's the gender? What's the marital status? And you can break it all down. I mean, that's just part of it, right? Education and social class can be upper class, lower class, middle class, and everything too, even race, religion, creed, color. Because the reason I say that is if you try selling a product or try monetizing to your audience that won't resonate with the actual thing you're monetizing with, you won't make any money. And the demographics in marketing, we call it market segmentation, where we take a piece of every one of those demographic makeup and we put our audience together. We have like a profile, and that could be, let's say I see age, gender, and we can even say geographically too. So I could say
Yes.
single men between the age of 25 and 35 from Canada and the United States or from North America, right? If you break it down that way, then you can figure out what's the best monetization strategy for my audience.
Hmm.
And it's really important. Now, once you figure that out, then comes time to saying, okay, what can I do with this audience? how are they going to actually buy my product or service or whatever the monetization is? How can I sell them? Because if you try selling too much, you lose your audience as well.
That's true.
Then you sound salesy, and that's not a good thing. So what I do is I tell people, once you understand your audience, and I will drill that into people's heads. It's really important. Then figure out there are literally about 10 different ways to monetize. What's the best monetization opportunity for that audience? Is it affiliate programs? And if it's an affiliate program where you are telling people, hey, read this book and go to Amazon, and Amazon pays you a commission. And that's been around for about 25 years.
Yes.
There are literally about 1,000 affiliate programs out there. So if, let's say, your podcast is about football, maybe you can find affiliate programs selling football tickets. In the United States, we have NFL, so you have like the NFL tickets. Or let's say that maybe the World Cup is coming up and you are a big soccer fan and your audience, you have a soccer podcast, right? What can you do to monetize that soccer podcast? Well, the World Cup is coming up. What can you do? Do you want to sell mugs from Cafe Press and you make a little commission on that? Or do you want to do something else? Or maybe you just have teenagers and they just want to know, how do they get their message out there? Well, you can sell a social media marketing book on TikTok.
Right.
Right. I mean, I don't mean sell it on TikTok, like it's about TikTok.
About TikTok, yes.
And that is really a great, and that's only one thing, like affiliate programs. Now, here's another great way to monetize your podcast. I do not do this on Become a Successful Podcaster, but I still think it's a great idea. If you have a very loyal audience, you can sell premium podcast episodes. This is something that a lot of people don't think about. So if you have a good audience of about 500 people and they come to every single episode, you can say, okay, I have this really cool podcast episode. You can join my membership. You can like actually join my podcast, and it's only available to premium members.
Yes.
Right. And but you also have to decide what is that episode, because you still want to have free episodes. You don't want to lose people altogether.
Absolutely.
People that don't want to pay any money, you're going to lose them. So you take a couple of episodes, put it behind a paywall, and you monetize those. Then you have a nice balance going on. It doesn't have to be 50-50. So that's another way to do it. And I mean, I could just go on, Chris, with all types of monetization strategies, but those really work.
Well, this is good because you've whet our appetite, Bruce. We want more. So listen, what I'm going to do, I have links for your podcast, for your World Podcast Network, everything. I have it down in the description of this episode. So everyone listening right now, you can go and listen to Bruce's podcast and hear some more of this insight, this wisdom that he's sharing on how you can monetize your podcast. Because sometimes we just need to listen to how someone else says something, and it will trigger something in our minds of how we can apply a particular strategy into our own podcast. Because that strategy of having paid podcasts at 80% free and then 20% of your podcast episode is paid, I think a lot of podcasters who have that loyal audience can actually use that and bring in some revenue through their podcast. So that's a really good strategy that I think a lot of people can easily do, because they're already podcasting, they're already making an episode. Just make a special episode, make some free, and make 20% of your episodes paid behind a paywall some way. And I know that there are some of the podcasting apps that you can actually do that, where you can have it for paid subscribers, or you can use things like Patreon to put it behind. Like they have to be a Patreon member to get access to those paid episodes. Oh wow! So this is great insight. Now, I want to just pick your brain from a technical perspective, right? Because we talked about earlier about some of the challenges when people start, and you mentioned, what tools and things that people should get. Now, so you've been in podcasting for a long time in the sphere of podcasting, and I know you said that you started your podcast in 2020. But in terms of hardware and software and tools that you use, what do you use? I don't know if maybe when you started podcasting to where you are now, can you give us a rundown of what your podcasting toolbox looks like?
Sure. It hasn't really changed very much, except for now I have a Tascam, and I'm looking at it right now. If you are a musician, you have your own recording studio at home and you're producing music, you might have what I have, but most podcasters don't need it. And that is a 32 track recording console. And I
Hmm.
use Tascam. But if you don't have any money, because that thing is $500,
Yeah.
when people spend that money. If you don't have any money, the bare minimum is a decent microphone like this. I see, Chris, you have a great microphone.
Yep.
This one is this I actually bought at Staples for $70, and it has both, as I was mentioning, an XLR and a USB connection.
Hmm.
So the XLR can go into your recording console,
Yep.
and that's like the big 3-pin one. And then the USB can go into your laptop, and you
Right.
have recording software. So I love the sound on the Tascam. I use that. And there are other recording consoles out there just for podcasts, right? They're usually like 2 or 3 different tracks for
Right.
guests and the hosts and things like that. So that is what I use. And then a great microphone and editing software. And really, that's it. I mean, I don't have much more than that.
Yeah, I don't think I told you before, but I'm a musician as well. So I used to produce
I see your
music.
guitar.
Yeah, my guitar is right behind me. I used to produce music. I play the keys and the guitar, and I used to produce music. Oh man, for like I want to say 15 years now. And
That's
that's
wild.
actually how I transitioned into podcasting because I had all these tools. Most of my equipment is digital. So I had what's it called? Pro Tools.
Yeah, I love Tool.
And I had a Persona Studio One. So I used to do all my podcasts, recording and editing on those software. And for all the podcasters out there, completely overkill. You don't need that to start a podcast, okay? You can
No, you
use
don't. Nope.
you can use Audacity because Audacity is free and those softwares that I had completely overkill. You don't need it to start a podcast. Use
Yeah, Pro
Audacity.
Tools is a little expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Too
But
much
if
for a
you
podcast.
Yeah, I mean, Audacity is great. I actually use Magix, and
I never heard of that one.
Magix is a German company. It's not like Magic. It's Magix.
Hmm.
And you see them if you have Best Buy by you could see that they are all over. I mean, they do great video editing and everything like that. Magix is a really good audio visual editing software, and they have a lot of different products. I've been using Magix for about something like about 15 years. And
Hmm.
I honestly see I see Pro Tools no better than Magix. Pro Tools, Magix, Cakewalk, Sonic, they all offer the same thing. They're DAWs. For
Hmm.
those people that don't know, that's digital audio workstation, and only really producers of music know that. But
So we understand though.
we know that. I don't want to bore people with all the technical stuff. But yeah, I mean, I don't use Pro Tools. Magix is amazing. You can
Mhm.
like just go to magix.com, and they do have software for podcasts.
Yeah. So this is what I love. So I love getting into the technical parts of it.
Yeah.
Um, but the one thing I want to make sure that I stress for everyone listening, if you start your podcast, whatever software you use, just make sure that it's something that you're comfortable using,
Yes.
that it's easy for you to grasp and understand the concept and know how to navigate through it. Whatever is easiest for you to use for your podcast, use that one, right?
Yeah.
Because
And Audacity is easy.
it's very easy. And a lot of these softwares, the end result is the same thing. You'll have a finished piece of audio or
Yeah.
video, and you can publish that as your podcast, right? So that's the end result. Most of these tools that we're talking about will lead you to that end results, but use whatever you're comfortable using. And the Audacity is free. So go and get Audacity, try that out, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, try something else. Like I said, I have a whole bunch of resources on my cheat sheet. Get it in the description, and you can try some of those resources and see how they work for you.
That's
Um,
cool.
Before we close off, is there anything that I may have forgotten to ask you that you want to share to anyone else listening right now?
Oh, absolutely. I'm the one person in the world who coined the term podcast network. They call me the Godfather of Podcast Networks. And why? And I didn't make that up, by the way. I'd never spread that around, but I am now because people are now calling me that. When I was in college, I wanted to be a radio DJ, and that was in New Jersey. No vacancy on the radio station was available for me.
Hmm.
So I never became a radio DJ. And that was in the 80s. Now, when 2005 came about and podcasting was starting to become podcasting, and being the programmer I am, I wanted to build that type of website, which we now have as the World Podcast Network. I didn't know what to call it. I had no idea. I was thinking radio network, TV network, podcast network.
Huh.
And now there are hundreds of podcast networks all over the world. I still will say this. I am the person who made that term, and I love it. Now we're the biggest podcast network in the world. We're the first. So I'm very happy about that.
Wonderful. So if we look up podcast network in the dictionary, we should see your face beside the word.
Yeah, you probably won't. Probably won't, but there are now people who are actually blogging about that. So that's cool. I love it. It's
Wonderful.
It's such a great feeling.
Yeah, wonderful. The fact that you came up with something first and now you see that something that you created has gained so much traction and so much
Amazing.
other people. That must be such an amazing feeling. Wow, this has been great, Bruce. I don't know what else to say. So listen, I'm going to let everybody know again, Bruce's links for all of his podcasts, for the World Podcast Network, his socials, his LinkedIn page, everything. It's all in the description. I'm going to encourage you to go and listen to Bruce's podcast and connect with him on social media, on wherever he is on the World Podcast Network, and connect with him so that you can continue to learn and try to get your podcast to the next level through some of the things that he is doing. Exactly. He's encouraging you to come aboard. That's it. Bruce, this has been great. I mean, I've learned so much from this conversation that we just had, and I look forward to maybe we can connect more in the future. Thank you so much for being on I Made a Podcast, and I look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure, and we'll do more. And you're going to come on my podcast too, I'm sure.
Hey, you just send the invite and let's do it.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bruce. All right, everyone, that's it for another episode of I Made a Podcast. Bruce was amazing. He knocked it out of the park. Now, I'm going to encourage you to go follow Bruce's podcast. It's How to Become a Successful Podcaster. It's on all the podcasting apps, and you want to join the World Podcast Network. So I've placed links for all of these things in the description, so you can follow Bruce, join the podcast network, follow his podcast, subscribe. And I want to remind you guys that I have a podcasting cheat sheet. So you can take the information that Bruce taught us today, use the resources on my cheat sheet, and start your podcast and start to make impact and get traction, get downloads, and get your message out there to the world. And that's what it's about. It's about getting your message out there and making impact with what you have inside of you. Now, as I mentioned, the cheat sheet is a list of resources, and I call it a cheat sheet because most of the resources on that resource list are free. So you can start to use them without spending any money. So go get the cheat sheet, start your podcast. And I want to help you start a podcast because the best time to start a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. So you can go ahead and make it happen. It's up to you, but I'm here to help you. So you'll hear from me again next week on I Made a Podcast. Peace.